Will you all pray with me? Dear Lord, once again, we thank you for this place. And we ask that you bless it, bless the people here, that we might be able to learn more about you, more about ourselves, and more about each other. I love you. Amen. So I was trying to think of the best way that I could describe how I thought Mary was feeling as soon as the angel departed in the passage that Bob just read. I mean, maybe it's just me. Maybe Mary may have calmly taken the news that Gabriel brought to her and said, sure, it sounds great. Maybe I'm off about how it would feel to find out that you're having a child. That you're having a child when you have not done the things that you're supposed to do to have a child. And that child also just happens to be the son of the Most High. And P.S., your formerly barren relative Elizabeth, she's also having a kid. All that might possibly be a cause for a little bit of emotion. And that's not even counting the whole, hey God, nice to hear from you after 400 years thing. Because, for some background, Jesus' birth story comes after 4 centuries of the Promised Land being conquered. First by the Assyrians, then the Babylonians, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and finally the Romans. People have lived their entire lifetimes, entire generations, in periods of war and conflict. They're desperately looking for God and unable to find anything remotely like God. This is expressed in Psalm 74 when the psalmist straight up says, we don't see our emblems, we don't have any prophets, no one knows how long this will last. God, how long is this going to last? And how can you just sit there? It's not hard to picture many folks living life without really knowing God on any sort of a personal level. That's why we should not take lightly the way that God acts with Mary and the way that Mary responds. God knows that this is going to be a surprise to her, especially given how well things went the last time he shared with someone about a birth. Earlier in this very chapter of Luke, an angel visits the priest Zechariah, Elizabeth's husband, visits him in the temple. And even though that announcement at least makes more sense from a reproductive standpoint, Zechariah doubts how he as an old man could possibly conceive with his barren wife. And his questions essentially earn him a timeout with God, as he is then made mute for 9 months until the birth of John the Baptist. So Luke then contrasts this righteous elder, experienced, wise temple priest with the young virgin from the middle of nowhere Galilee to emphasize just how great her faith was and just how wise she was. It may seem odd that Mary's question does not garner the same reaction from God as Zechariah's did. Education, the same training, the same expectations of God's return that Zechariah had. She instead would have been focused on the day-to-day life of living in small-town Nazareth. Her concerns with when God was finally going to speak again were much lower on the totem pole than getting through the week. That's why Luke describes Mary as perplexed when Gabriel arrives. She really has no idea or notion as to what exactly is going on. And though Mary may not have known about God all that well at that point, God does know Mary. There's no other way for God to have known that she would have the faith that would allow for her to bear Jesus himself. So along with being patient and understanding with her, God worked in a way that revealed a reason to trust. The healing action that took place in someone in Mary's family, Elizabeth. Someone Mary knew, someone Mary could share the experience with, and a means for God to develop a personal relationship with Mary. All this is what makes Mary's faith so truly incredible. Given all of this, she asks one, and frankly, quite fair, question of Gabriel before telling him, "Here am I, let it be." And so often we reach this point in the narrative and either start humming the Beatles or just keep going with the story. Either way, we miss out on learning the depth of Mary's character that reveals just how special she was. You see, just because Mary expresses great faith does not mean she is not experiencing a great deal of fear. We tend to think that faith and fear are an either-or thing, when in reality they almost complement each other. We tend to view fear as something that we are supposed to hide, when it's a natural emotion that occurs in all of us. Mary has plenty of this natural emotion going on after hearing a message like this from Gabriel. Even God's call for her to not fear was more likely to be understood as referring to the whole angel visiting thing. There was little that could be done about the fear that would take place after God's physical presence departed. What is Joseph going to think? What are the neighbors going to think? What am I going to say? What am I going to do? Who could possibly believe this story? And it is in this fear that Mary chooses to be faithful. It's saying a lot for a girl that we believe to be no older than her late teens when this is happening. And it's not just that Mary is young. The things that she will have to face as a result of this plan of God are far from easy and most definitely not safe. The punishment for adultery in the Jewish community was harsh and unforgiving, especially to women. Joseph would be plenty aware when Mary started showing that he was not father of that child. And Mary knew she would be at the mercy of his response. If he reacted angrily, then she would be quickly brought up on charges of having been with another man. And even if Joseph quietly dismissed her, which was his original plan, according to Matthew, there would be no other suitors for a young single mother during that time. So not only was her life at stake, but even if Mary were to survive, her livelihood was in great peril. Marriage during this time period was more about safety and security, social protection, extending the family line, than it was about love. But yet Mary was at risk of losing all of those things and being forced to survive off of her parents at best and on the streets at worst. So we see Mary in the midst of all this, holding a fear that is not mutually exclusive of the faith that she also decides to hold. It is not that she is afraid, it's not that she is not afraid, it is how she chooses to respond to being afraid. It is not that she is calm and relaxed, it is that she is assured that simply she's not alone in her fear. So rather than run from the fear, she runs with it. She allows God to work through her to bring about the very physical presence of God, Emmanuel, in Jesus. The one whose birth we celebrate and whose birth marks the beginning of God's redemption and reconciliation in our world. But see, we are fortunate because we know the ending of this story. We have Jesus. We know that Jesus will come. Mary does not have that luxury. Much like we don't have the luxury of knowing how God will act in our world today. Mary gives herself to God's will, even though the world that she lives in gives plenty of reason to be terrified of what God's will has asked of her. Much like we can feel terrified of the thought of what God might ask of us today. That's what makes this fear something we can relate to this Advent season. I cannot stand up here and tell you that I know what God's will is for each of us. But I can tell you that the world that we live in is not the one that God intended. The brokenness of our world gives plenty of reason to be terrified. We live in a world that acts out their fear through riots, through abuse, through killing. A world that acts out fear by leading people to judge others not on their character, but on the color of their skin, on the subject of their love, and on the uniform that they wear to work each day. Fear drives us to have a presence of closing our borders to the communities abroad that are dying of disease. We fear the unknown, the confusing, and the different. We fear the Ferguson and the Ebola, and we find ourselves in a place that the acts of a few have shaken our faith in a community that swore an oath to protect us. Yes, we live in a world that it seems downright ridiculous to tell anyone to have no fear. We live in a world that seems to be missing God's presence and is most definitely missing God's love. It is with this in mind that I bring up the question that we have pondered the past few weeks. What are we looking for this Christmas? I, for one, am looking for God. Not because I'm a seminary student, not because I'm in church, because I'm a person that is thrown off by the brokenness of our world, and I want to yell at God, how long is this going to last, and how can you just sit there? And it is usually in those moments that God will indeed respond by asking of me, Sean, how will you let me act? How will we let God act? This Christmas, this Advent season, what if what we are looking for is how we can let God act in us? How can we reach a point where we honestly and openly and lovingly tell God, here am I? How can we allow the Holy Spirit to work in us the way it worked through Mary? How can we let God use our very selves to bring about the redemption, the healing that we long for? What needs to change in us for that to happen? What needs to happen with our fears, our presuppositions, our view of things, in order to allow God to act in us and through us? What do we need to challenge ourselves with, and what do we need support with? Because, my friends, in a few minutes we will leave this blessed place and go back into a world that has much to be afraid of. My prayer is that we do not run from that fear to something, but instead run with that fear to someone. May we, like Mary, keep our faith in God in the midst of the fear that we live in. May we keep our hope in God's love, in God's action, in God's presence alive when all we see is darkness. May we, like Mary, have the courage to run with our fear and not run from it. Because maybe then, like Mary, we can find ourselves speaking those words of wisdom. Let it be, dear Lord, let it be. Will you pray with me? God, once again, we thank you for this time to be with one another, this time to seek support in this community. And we ask that you continue to reveal your presence in our lives and in our thoughts, in our minds as we go forth from this place, that we might know you and know your will. We love you. Amen.